Who are the pastors who absolutely just love the cash? And of course, love donations from their followers. All in the name of God, of course. Let's get started with number 4, Lamar Whitehead. Lamar Whitehead is a Brooklyn-based pastor known for his flashy lifestyle, and he's someone we've covered before. And this is his latest update. Allegedly, Whitehead defrauded his parishioners out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Federal agents arrested Lamar Whitehead, the Leaders of Tomorrow International Church founder, in December 2022. However, this wasn't his first interaction with the law. Whitehead's criminal history began in 2006 with an arrest over an identity theft scam that used the names of people living in Brooklyn and Long Island. At the time, he faced 10 counts of identity theft. He was released early for good behavior from Sing Sing Correctional Facility in 2013. A year later, Whitehead received a cease and desist letter from the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office over his false claims of promoting a collaborative justice initiative with the DA's office that year. In 2016, despite owing $251,000 for an outstanding court judgment over an unpaid personal loan in 2009, Whitehead drove around Brooklyn in a Bentley and Maserati. Whitehead also allegedly scammed $90,000 out of one of his parishioners. The woman was reluctant to hand over her life savings, but trusted him. At the time, she struggled to secure a mortgage with her low credit score, and Whitehead offered to help. As the savings were her only source of income, he promised to pay her $100 a month, but he supposedly only made one payment in January 2021. She wired Whitehead the money, but rather than spend it on her new home, he treated himself to expensive clothes, among other things. When she asked about her new home, Whitehead claimed he'd talked to her after his election campaign for Brooklyn Borough President. Later, Whitehead told her he had no obligation to pay her back and would invest the cash in his own company. She learned he'd used the money to buy a $4.4 million home and sought a $1 million judgment in the scam. Whitehead allegedly had other victims too, including a businessman he extorted out of $5,000 after promising they'd make millions of dollars if he could borrow $50,000. He touted his relationship with New York City Mayor Eric Adams, claiming he could get favors from the New York City government. Adams had supported Whitehead and his ministry since it opened in 2013 and spoke fondly of him at events. His ministry's website had a donate button, despite his claims that the organization didn't solicit funds. In an indictment against Whitehead, there were claims that he threatened at least one victim who only made a payment to the pastor under the instruction of the authorities investigating Whitehead at the time. At the time of his arrest, he told authorities he only had one phone, but had texted one of his victims to contact him on a different phone. As part of his indictment, he had to forfeit every belonging obtained through his offenses. For anything that couldn't be found or obtained, federal agents had permission to seize other items that equaled the value of those belongings. As of December 2022, Whitehead's case is ongoing. He's charged with extortion, wire fraud, and making material false statements. If convicted, he could face a maximum of 65 years in prison. Number 3, the Edwards family. The Edwards family ran a faith-based charity that pledged to teach the Christian faith and be devoted to service. Fall of 2020, they allegedly pulled off a multi-million-dollar fraud when they applied for the COVID relief program created for small businesses and nonprofit organizations. Parents Evan and Mary Jane Edwards and their adult children, Joy and Josh, filed paperwork claiming that the ministry, Aslan International Ministry, handled a monthly payroll of $2.7 million and had 486 employees. After receiving $8 million from the government, the family was on the radar of federal investigators who found inconsistencies in the claims they made in their application. One of the most alarming facts was that the accountant who signed off on the loan suffered from dementia and hadn't worked for the organization in 3 years. Federal investigators visited the ministry's Orlando office but found the doors were locked, and neighboring businesses claimed to have never seen anyone inside. The ministry's website appeared inactive, donation links not working, and blurbs that seemed to have been copied from other religious websites. By the fall of 2020, federal agents were planning on questioning the family when police officers pulled them over for speeding in their Mercedes SUV. All 4 suspects were in the car, and Evan Edwards explained they were on their way to a conference in Texas. Federal agents arrived and searched the vehicle, where it became clear this wasn't an ordinary road trip. Edwards sat with a laser printer on his lap, and in one of the rear passenger seats were 2 clear bags filled with shredded paperwork. Authorities found suitcases filled with financial records, 2 Faraday bags to block any sort of GPS tracking with tablets and laptops inside, a paper shredder, and backpacks filled with external hard drives and USB drives. A Florida federal judge ordered the forfeiture of the $8 million they received from the government, claiming the money was the proceeds from money laundering and bank fraud. Despite this, the family wasn't charged with any crimes. Federal agents gathered information about the family, visiting Aslan International Office's deserted headquarters and chasing down Walter Nita, the accountant who supposedly signed Aslan's loan application. Nita's son spoke on his behalf, confirming his father's dementia. The $2.7 million monthly payroll mentioned in the loan application was far from the actual monthly income, which was closer to $5,500. Federal authorities had been watching the Edwards family for some time when they knocked on the Edwards' front door in September 2020, but nobody answered. 9 days later, agents returned with a search warrant to find that the house was empty. The Evans family was pulled that same evening, and authorities took the family into custody. All 4 were charged with filing false immigration documents at the Canadian border when they had originally moved to the U.S. Their forms claimed they'd be working for Walter Nita despite his ailing health. However, those charges were dismissed when a U.S. Customs officer admitted to having misread the interview reports. Nita's son suggested the family could have forged his father's signature on the visa applications, but he could have also signed the documents and not remembered. Months after the traffic stop, Edwards and his son returned to their boarded-up family home without his wife or daughter, whose whereabouts unknown. In December 2022, officers arrested Edwards and his son at their Florida home. The arrest came 5 months after an NBC News report brought new attention to their case. Their charges included multiple counts of fraud, and their first court appearances did not go well. Evan Edwards refused to go due to struggles in his health that forced him to be in a wheelchair, and he didn't want to be in a court holding cell in his chair. Josh Edwards wouldn't answer even the most basic questions asked by the judge in the hearing. The judge ordered the pair to stay in custody pending completing psychiatric and medical exam. There's much of this crazy story we couldn't get into here, so for a deeper dive into the insane details, click the link here. Number 2. Ivon Hampton Barley. Florida church pastor Ivon Hampton Barley allegedly used her relationship to exploit an elderly couple to clean out their bank account and steal their home. Ivon Hampton Barley's 10-year friendship with an elderly, childless couple seemed innocent initially. She was the founder and pastor of True Spirit of Christ Our Redeemer Christian Ministries and spent time with members of her church, including the elderly couple, both of whom were suffering from Alzheimer's and dementia. However, family members of the couple were suspicious of Hampton Barley early on and did not approve of her time with them. Their concerns were warranted, as Hampton Barley's time with the couple was more sinister than anybody realized. Over several months, Hampton Barley altered their retirement funding, added her name to the victims' bank accounts, and attempted to cash out their life insurance policy. Hampton Barley would pretend to be the couple's caretaker or daughter, and even added her name to the male victim's bank account. She withdrew roughly $18,000 from their accounts while claiming she had power of attorney. While posing as the couple's friend, Hampton Barley transferred ownership of their home to herself and set herself up as their sole beneficiary so that she would inherit their assets when they died. When the couple's niece, Nadine, discovered Hampton Barley's name on their deed while reviewing their personal affairs, she contacted an attorney. The attorney found that Hampton Barley diverted funds from his client's accounts to her own and cashed out the surrender value of the couple's life insurance policy. While investigating True Spirit of Christ Our Redeemer Christian Ministries further, the church's most recent physical address appears to be a luxury 22-story condo building where one of the church's officers reside. No information about the church could be found outside of the listing in Sunbiz Florida's business registry, where it was listed as a nonprofit. The family's attorney couldn't even confirm if the couple had actually attended the church, if that's where they had met Hampton Barley, or if the church even existed at all. Within days of the arrest, not one member of the church had come forward to defend their pastor. In fact, the family's attorney found found unusual, since the pastors often have strong relationships with their parishioners. Family filed a lawsuit against Hampton Barley in the spring of 2020, but ended the litigation as family members didn't want to put the couple through more distress. However, they were able to restore the deed to the couple. Hampton Barley might have dodged the litigation, but Miami-Dade police arrested and criminally charged her with grand theft, organized scheme to defraud, and exploitation of the elderly. Hampton Barley is now awaiting a judge's decision, which could end up including restitution of the stolen money. Number 1. Shepherd Bushiri. Malawi-born Shepherd Bushiri is a Christian preacher many believe to be a prophet with healing powers. Bushiri amassed a substantial following and ran churches from Ghana to South Africa. His followers flocked to listen to his sermons, although some needed more from him than his teachings. Supposedly, Bushiri performed miracles that changed people's lives, with his followers believing he could heal them and improve their lives. Bushiri often spoke about the miracles he'd performed, claiming he'd cured people of HIV, changed the fortunes of those living in poverty, made blind people see, and once walked on air. So, like Chris Angel. Bushiri offered a range of products at the large church complex, the Enlightened Christian Gathering, where he preached. On Sundays, he attracted roughly 40,000 people, all of whom would listen to the prophet's teachings, and some would do some shopping before they left. Bushiri sold merchandise at the stalls around the complex. Some of his products included branded t-shirts, towels, caps, calendars, wristbands, and even miracle oil. Vendors advertised that Bushiri blessed all their merchandise, so everything had healing power. Pfizer must be a little nervous. Bushiri soon amassed impressive wealth, although nobody knew his specific net worth. His fortune allowed him to buy 4 private planes and several hotels. He was also rumored to have been interested in several mines. Allegations of unsafe practices by the preacher were brought to light when congregants had to perform questionable acts to demonstrate their faith, where they ate rats, snakes, and grass and drank petroleum. It sounds like Bushiri was starting a fraternity. Despite filling sports stadiums during his services, some people were skeptical of Bushiri. They believed he was extorting those living in poverty who were so desperate to improve their lives they were willing to buy his snake oil with the hopes it would help their situation. While impoverished people sought change by buying his products, Bushiri became one of the wealthiest religious leaders in Africa. South African authorities arrested Bushiri and his wife on fraud and money laundering charges, but the couple skipped bail and fled to Malawi. According to Bushiri, his life was under threat, and the South African authorities didn't offer him protection. He addressed his supporters on social media and told them his decision to skip bail was to save him and his wife lives. After they fled, South Africa quickly issued arrest warrants for skipping bail. The specific way that Bushiri and his wife left the country was unknown. However, one theory was that a syndicate specializing in taking stolen cars from South Africa to Malawi helped sneak them out. The situation threatened to cause diplomatic tension between Malawi and South Africa, especially when a rumor circulated that the couple fled South Africa with Malawi's president Lazarus Chakwera on his presidential jet, although Chakwera's office and South African authorities denied those claims. A Malawi court deemed Bushiri's arrest illegal because it did not pass through the Minister of Homeland Security. In November 2020, Malawian authorities arrested the pastor and his wife when Interpol issued an arrest warrant for the two. However, his troubles in South Africa were far from over, where the government charged him with stealing $6.6 million through money laundering, fraud, theft. They also broke the conditions of their bail by leaving the country. Bushiri spoke to reporters outside the Malawi court, claiming he wasn't celebrating his victory, but a victory of God instead. While talking about justice prevailing, he forgot that South Africa would likely send an extradition request for him and his wife. In response to violating his jail conditions, the South African court seized his residence, although he appeared unfazed by the situation, stating he didn't care about his assets. Fears of Bushiri's release hurting Malawi's relations with South Africa complicated the extradition process. As part of the South African development community, Malawi and South Africa had already promised the protocol on extradition that they would send back fugitives. However, as of early 2022, their extradition case is ongoing. Who are some of the scammers who completely deserve the consequences of their actions? Let's get right into it with number 6, sister scammers. 3 sisters, Lindsay Burden, Emmeline Burden, and Sarah Burden, ran an all-female fraud gang that used stolen receipts and credit card numbers to steal tens of thousands of pounds of designer clothes, beauty treatments, and cash. The sisters would steal cash register receipts and use the card details to make fraudulent purchases. They would claim their cards were damaged and, shortly after the purchases, would return the items for cash. The trio manipulated sales assistants into issuing refunds to their accounts using ATMs in stores. The sisters would would frequently book hotel rooms and then contact the front desk to say they had a family emergency and had to cancel. They would present a different card number for the refund. Sometimes they would pick up a card device and enter a PIN default to refund themselves for whatever they wanted. The Burden sisters didn't always use the cards for refunds. They also bought various items like designer clothing, power tools, high-performance car parts, motorcycles, and motorcycle accessories. However, the three women had to change their approach when the pandemic hit and the country went into lockdown. They shifted their focus to off-license alcohol stores and gas stations where they would use stolen card details to purchase hundreds of dollars worth of alcohol, lottery tickets, and cigarettes. In May 2020, the police raided several homes across Greater Manchester where they lived and eventually arrested the sisters. During the raids, police seized motorcycle clothing, a motor vehicle, furniture, electric scooters, and large amounts of cash. Businesses suffered significant losses due to the Burden sisters' actions, totaling almost $75,000. Employees who the women unknowingly trapped in the scheme also suffered the consequences. One victim, Phil Sargent, almost lost his job. He worked for Millennium Motorcycles, a place that the women frequented often. Sargent's boss suspended him for the cash losses, and he suffered from severe depression as a result. After a disciplinary hearing, his manager told him he could keep his job but was placed on probation. Lindsay Burden's lawyer, Christopher Hunt, claimed his client experienced many issues in her life which led to low self-worth. He stated she committed her crimes out of desperation, and it was inevitable police would catch her at some point. Emmeline Burden's lawyer also defended his client, saying she wasn't living a luxurious lifestyle and was sending some money to other individuals. The Burden sisters pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and received a total prison sentence 4.5 years. Sarah was jailed for 18 weeks, Lindsay was jailed for 2 years and 2 months, and Emmeline was jailed for 22 months. Each one now has to bear their own burden. Number 5. Accidental exploitation. In August 2020, a Volkswagen Polo carrying 4 young men crashed into a house and burst into flames. No one made it inside the car. The car traveled up to 120 miles per hour, and the driver's blood alcohol levels exceeded the legal limit. Passers-by desperately tried to save the young men. A truck driver and a taxi driver described hearing screaming and shouting coming from the car, but were unable to rescue the young men because of the force of the flames and heat they produced. Shortly after the accident, Jason McDonald created the fake GoFundMe page where he elicited donations under the guise of using them to create a permanent memorial in remembrance of the 4 victims. But he never intended on using the money for anything but himself. His accomplice, Kyle Saunders, helped him set up the page, hoping to get a cut of the profit. They raised money quickly, with people thinking their donations were for the victims' memorial. The page raised roughly $7,800, but their access to the money didn't last long. Detectives received a tip-off about the fraudulent page. Police investigated the case and found evidence linking McDonald and Saunders to the crime. During a search, police also found McDonald in possession of illegal substances with the intent to sell them. McDonald was charged with possessing criminal property in the form of the money raised on the GoFundMe page and possession. Saunders was charged with fraud by false representation. Families of the victims set up a genuine fundraising page which raised roughly $11,000. They used the money to create a garden of reflection at a nearby park. Number 4. Dr. Fraud vanishes. 2 gangs ran an elaborate operation to scam insurance companies over bogus car accident claims. They allegedly bribed police dispatchers and healthcare workers to obtain information about New York and New Jersey car accident victims. The gangs would then connect with crooked doctors who performed unnecessary medical procedures on the victims. Then the gangs overbilled insurance companies by exploiting automobile laws requiring companies to pay for the victims' medical bill. First criminal enterprise was led by Alexander Little Alec Golkarov, who stole over $30 million by paying medical organizations to use their legal licenses as part of the scheme. He enlisted the help of Albert Aronov, an NYPD officer who supposedly performed extensive searches through department computers to obtain information about accident victims. Meanwhile, a gang of runners allegedly bribed public servants to acquire confidential information, which they then used to guide patients to the doctors affiliated with the gang. Doctors Rolando Chumachero and Marcelo Quiroga also played a significant role in the scam. They would prescribe unnecessary and extensive medical treatments to accident victims. The doctors would then overbill insurance companies under the no-fault laws, which required insurance companies to cover medical bills related to car accidents. Golkarov and his co-conspirators Roman Israelov, Peter Kamov, and Anthony DiPietro could face over 3 decades behind bars. Dr. Chumachero and Dr. Quiroga faced up to 10 years in jail, and Albert Aronov could face face up to 5 years in prison. A second group, led by Bradley Pierre, ran a similar, more profitable operation. The group fraudulently owned and operated 5 healthcare companies through bribes and kickbacks. Over 13 years, they made over $70 million in profits. Pierre enlisted the help of Dr. Marvin Moy and Dr. William Weiner. Dr. Moy reportedly conducted unnecessary and sometimes painful electrodiagnostic testing on patients, while Dr. Weiner falsified clinical injury findings and MRIs to increase patient referrals. No-fault accident schemes like this can cost insurance companies millions of dollars and have become increasingly popular. The schemes involve providing phony or unnecessary medical services to accident victims, leading to increased costs for consumers, private insurance, or government-subsidized programs designed to help those in need. The story took a strange turn when Dr. Moy was involved in a completely not suspicious boating accident off the coast of Long Island. Allegedly, Moy's boat collided with a larger vessel about 25 miles off the coast of Fire Island, throwing Moy overboard. Coast Guard reported that Moy's boat sank and they found debris and oil sheen in the water. However, Moy's friends found the whole situation unusual. Moy loved to boat, but it didn't make sense for him to be so far out to sea after midnight during the week. The Coast Guard conducted boat and helicopter searches for 30 hours over almost 5,000 nautical miles. The next day, they called off the search. There was a passenger with Moy that night who was found shortly after the accident, but Dr. Moy has yet to be recovered. Sounds like something fishy happened. Number 3. Riley's Warrior. Lindsay Abul created a GoFundMe campaign called Riley's Warriors, where she claimed her 11-year-old daughter, Riley, was suffering from a terminal central nervous system disease and that her brain was shutting down. Abul and Riley appeared on a local news station where Abul spoke about her daughter giving up her dream of playing softball as her doctors were too worried that the sport's physical demands would be too tough on the girl. Malone University's softball team was touched when they learned about Riley's story. They invited her to throw the first pitch in a scrimmage against Walsh University and shared the GoFundMe campaign with their fan base. The only problem was that Riley's illness was fake, and her mother scammed $5,000 in GoFundMe donations. In May 2021, someone tipped off the Stark County Department of Job and Family Services to say that Abul was scamming people and lying about her daughter's illness. When authorities investigated the case, they discovered that a medical professional found no evidence to back up Abul's claim, even though Abul and Riley attended 3 years of therapy to learn how to cope with her death. Abul pleaded guilty to charges of child endangerment and theft. Her lawyer claimed it was the best choice for Riley as it avoided further traumatizing her after being put through so much. Abul was sentenced to 4 to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay $8,500 in restitution. Riley, thankfully, now lives with her father. Number 2. NYPD union boss busted. Edward Mullins was once the respected leader of the Sergeants Benevolent Association, also known as the SBA, one of the largest and most combative police unions in New York City. That was until news broke he had been stealing from the organization for decades. Mullins allegedly fraudulently reimbursed himself for nearly $1 million of personal expenses he charged to his credit card over his almost 20 years as a union president. Some of these expenses included luxury items, expensive meals, college tuition. Mullins would file tweaked expense reports with the union treasurer, but rarely provided receipts. The treasurer still gave him reimbursement check, which he would deposit into his account and use to pay his credit card bills. Mullins also altered his credit card statements to make it appear that items cost more than they did. The money went toward everything from a relative's college tuition to expensive jewelry, clothing, home appliances, and meals. In 2019, he sought a $3,000 reimbursement from meals at a Greenwich Village restaurant, despite the meals being unrelated to his union work. Mullins was one of the most combative leaders in the history of the New York City Sergeants Union. He was known for his bombastic and sometimes vulgar statements and gained national attention when he came forward as a loyal supporter of former President Donald Trump. He was also a strong opponent of police reform and a fierce defender of past and present sergeants. His aggressive attitude often caused controversy. Tensions between Mullins and former Mayor Bill de Blasio escalated in 2020 when Mullins shared a police report on Twitter that detailed the arrest of de Blasio's daughter, Chiara. The arrest was over her participation in protests over police brutality and racial injustice. Mullins' Twitter usage has also got him in trouble. He used a vulgar name to refer to the city's health commissioner at the time, Dr. Oxiris Barbo, and disparaged Representative Richie Torres, city council member. In 2021, Mullins received a fine of roughly $32,000 for violating police department's social media rules for his online behavior. Later that year, in October 2021, federal investigators raided his home and the union headquarters. A month later, Mullins retired from the police department. Mullins served as president of the SBA from 2002 until October 2021 and operated his scheme throughout his entire time in the position. On February 22, 2022, Mullins surrendered to the FBI in Manhattan, where he was charged with 1 count of wire fraud. If convicted, Mullins faces up to 20 years in prison. Looks like Mullins wasn't as untouchable as he thought. Number 1. Pancreatic Nothing. Madison Russo took to TikTok and GoFundMe to talk about her battles with stage 2 pancreatic cancer, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and a tumor the size of a football that had wrapped around her spine. She documented her cancer battle on social media, sharing videos and posts of herself undergoing chemotherapy and radiation treatment. Russo claimed the treatments were making her very ill and spoke about the financial burden of medical bills, gas, meals, and expenses, which she didn't want to worry her family about. Her GoFundMe description urged people to donate to help cover her expenses so she could focus on beating cancer. Problem was that there was no cancer to beat. Russo gave talks about her health struggles at St. Ambrose University, where she was a student. There are reports she also spoke at the National Pancreatic Foundation. However, the National Pancreatic Foundation has denied she ever spoke at any of their events. She also appeared on the Project Purple podcast, a nonprofit organization aimed at raising awareness and funds for pancreatic cancer research, supporting patients and their families, and promoting early detection. Russo spoke of her struggles with pancreatic cancer and leukemia. When the truth about Russo's conditions came out, a spokesperson at the organization stated that they had no reason to think she wasn't telling the truth. Medical professionals were puzzled by Russo's posts on social media. They noticed many discrepancies in her videos, as her medical equipment and placement didn't seem appropriate for her supposed treatment. Eventually, anonymous witnesses contacted authorities. Investigators learned she had never been diagnosed with any tumor or form of cancer at the medical facilities in the area. Russo allegedly stole photos that actual cancer patients shared online and presented them as her own. She told many lies in interviews, including alleging that doctors told her she had an 11% survival rate and had undergone dozens of rounds of chemotherapy. Russo was arrested and charged with first-degree theft after scamming over 439 donors out of $37,000. She was released on a $10,000 bond and is due back in court on March 2nd, 2023. She faces up to 10 years in prison if she's found guilty. Elaine Hoffman is a grandmother from Indiana who lived a quiet life. One morning in October 2015, she was going through her email when she noticed an advertisement to make money quick. Hoffman was no stranger to finances. She graduated college with a degree in math and had a successful career as a financial planner before she had to retire early due to health issues. But Elaine continued to manage her own retirement portfolio while investing in stocks and bonds. She managed to save enough money to keep her and her husband comfortable for the rest of their lives. But still, the ad intrigued her. She clicked on it and watched a video. In the clip, two attractive young millionaires talked to each other on board their private jet. They said that they made their fortune with the click of a button. Hoffman knew that they were just actors, but she still found herself wanting that lifestyle. When a phone number appeared at the end of the video, Hoffman called it. A man named Brian picked up the phone and said he was an account manager at Glenridge Capital. He told Hoffman that the company's mission was to usher clients into the realm of binary options trading. Hoffman never heard of binary options, but Brian broke it down for her. If she just invested a few $100s, she would be able to set up an investment account and place bets on the value of currencies and commodities, from crude oil to Nike stock, to see if they would increase or decrease by a certain point in time. If she was right, she could win a huge return. But if she was wrong, she'd lose her entire investment. Hoffman understood the risk and was wary to invest. But Brian assured her that he and his coworkers would watch the markets and help her make a wager. He guaranteed up to 40% returns in the first 3 months. Even though Hoffman didn't need the money, she didn't want to miss out on a great opportunity to increase her savings and leave more to her grandchildren. To start, she deposited $1,000, and with Brian's help, received a decent return. Then he told her that if she increased her deposit to $5,000, Glenridge would add another 50% to make it $7,500. She quickly sent the money over. 8 months later, she had invested $150,000. She continued to successfully place wagers and make profits. Some bets lasted weeks, others lasted minutes, but she never got upset when she lost. As an experienced finance employee, Hoffman knew that you had to take big risks to make big returns. By June 2016, 9 months after first seeing the ad for Glenridge Capital, Hoffman made a $4,000 profit. But when she tried to access her winnings, Hoffman was told she needed to make 1,000 high-risk trades first. She was frustrated and decided to pull her money out of Glenridge. But the manager said he couldn't do that. For a month, she kept trying, but was unable to withdraw her money. After a year, she'd only been able to take back $10,000 of her initial investment. Hoffman started to worry that she would never see her money again. One day, the Glenridge website went down. Hoffman called the office concerned. The person on the other line assured her that it was just a temporary service loss because the company was moving offices. When the website failed to relaunch, Hoffman continued calling over and over again. Eventually, they just stopped answering. On Instagram, Josh Carrut presented himself as a race car driver and successful entrepreneur. With his Dolce & Gabbana sneakers, perfectly coiffed hair, and frequent travel photos, Josh's 750,000 followers were frequently impressed by his posts. Every few days, he posted a solo shot of him in a new location, places like Rome, Abu Dhabi, Miami, and the Maldives. He befriended A-listers like James Marsden, Robert De Niro, and Martin Scorsese. He spent his riches on a custom private jet with carbon fiber trim. He owned 12 Ferraris and often paid the $75,000 fee to race them. His followers assumed he was either an up-and-coming tech billionaire or the heir to a massive family fortune. But the truth was that he was the son of a middle-class family from Ontario. Josh grew up in St. Catharines in the 1980s and 90s as a quiet, awkward kid. His mother died when he was 6, leaving him and his brothers to be raised by their dad. He dropped out of high school and began washing cars at his dad's car dealership. Josh's biggest goal in life was to get rich. In the early 2000s, Josh tried to make it in the art world as a film director, but success was taking longer than planned. So he pivoted to tech. He moved to Cyprus, where he started working at a gambling software company called Playtech. He studied the company's operations and took his boss's connections to build his own competitor gaming platform. After modest success, Josh then started calling himself an industry tycoon. By 2008, a California tech company recruited 29-year-old Carrut to be CEO of Rome Partners, another online gambling platform. On paper, he earned $165,000 per year, but apparently stole much more than that. Players accused Josh of denying them from their winnings and stealing entire jackpot prizes all for himself. In 2013, 2 investors from Wyoming launched a civil and federal court case against him for stealing their dividends from Rome Partners and pocketing the money into his personal bank account. A judge dismissed the charges when no one was sure exactly where Josh lived. Josh, as a dual Israeli-Canadian citizen, learned that he could use his passport to escape consequences. He couldn't get in trouble if no one could find him. In the meantime, he was becoming accustomed to the life of luxury that his stealing was giving him. He bought a Rolls-Royce and 2 Ferraris, worth a grand total of $1 million. He moved into a high-tech apartment in Budapest, Hungary, complete with humidity controls, a touch-activated light-up staircase, and TV screens that came down from the ceiling. He was living the dream and was looking for ways to maintain it. Then, Josh learned about a new kind of high-risk options trading that was growing in popularity in Israel: binary options. Binary options are basically code for gambling in the investment world. But of course, this is never told in this way with potential investors in binary options. Josh and his brothers, David and Jonathan, teamed up to make a pretty penny off of the general public who had no idea what they were getting into. Basically, in binary options trading, the investor will place a bet that a certain stock will be worth a certain amount at a certain time. If correct, the investor wins money. If wrong, he loses it all. But the Carrut brothers rigged the system so their company always won. Even when traded legally, binary options are risky because they can bankrupt investors in an instant. When the US first started allowing binary option trading in 2008, there were already a lot of scammers ready to prey on new investors. The FBI estimated that these scammers stole $10 billion every year between 2010 and 2017. Many of the fraudsters were operating overseas in Israel, much like Josh and his brothers. The Carruts chose to operate their business, Sandbox Media, out of Moshe Aviv Tower, the tallest skyscraper in Tel Aviv. They operated had 3 trading sites, including B Options, Glenridge Capital, and Rumelia. The company's employees promised potential investors quick returns of 60 to 85%, even though the majority ended up losing most of their money. Employees also lied about their qualifications, location, and identity. They claimed that their number one priority was to make money for their investors. In reality, they just wanted to rip off clients. So many Israelis entered the fraudulent binary options trade that the government outlawed the practice in October 2017. The Cartoons brand always manipulated their investors' bets so they would always end up winning and pocketing the money. A CFTC complaint says the brothers stole at least $165 million from their unknowing customers. They hired 40 people to work in call centers in Canada and the US under the umbrella company of Sandbox Media. They created ads containing flashy digital banners and even falsely stated that Trevor Noah made a fortune through binary options trading. Employees were encouraged to lie about their financial backgrounds and use pressure tactics on their cold calls to get people to invest. Caller IDs were hidden so that the numbers couldn't be tracked. The Carrut brothers all used stage names. Former employees described the call centers as boiler rooms, characterized by constant competition and toxic masculinity. Brokers were required to bring in $50,000 per month from investors and receive their salaries in cash. The Cartoons held sales contests and charted their callers' commissions on the boards to create a spirit of one-upmanship in the workplace. When one brother took some employees to Berlin, he gave them his corporate credit card and said to go nuts. The $25,000 bill was expensed as staff entertainment. The true nature of Sandbox Media was hidden from employees. A former office manager thought it was actually a marketing company. In reality, it was 20 different subsidiaries legally registered in more than 7 cities and not linked to one another, making it hard to trace them back to Sandbox Media. Third parties were responsible for the funds to shield the Carrut brothers from any suspicion. The company was incredibly successful, showing a multi-year profit of more than $233 million, outgrowing their corporate office in the Tel Aviv high-rise and moving to the ground floor of another building. The Cartoons started outsourcing their payment processing to third parties, which made profits increase even more. The success of the company attracted the attention of business magazines such as Forbes and the Financial Times, who Josh had interviews where he claimed he made his initial fortune through online gaming software and built on that by real estate and crypto investments. The Cartoons started drawing attention to themselves through their sports cars, racetracks, model girlfriends, and beachfront villas. For David Cartoon's 35th birthday, he threw a gangster-themed party at a nightclub where they dressed for the theme, drank expensive liquor, and took a video of the night, which they later posted on YouTube. Almost 1 year after Hoffman tried to withdraw her money, she was starting to lose hope. After several failed attempts to find the location of Glenridge Capital, she found out it might actually be based in Israel. She contacted a lawyer there, but nothing came of it. She realized she had been CC'd on an email with other Glenridge investors and decided to reach out to them. Elaine realized she was just one of thousands of victims all over the world. Some of them were out hundreds of thousands of dollars. A few of the other investors had already done some of their own research. No matter which Carrut brand they invested in, their credit cards had all been charged by Grey Mountain Management. Grey Mountain listed 2 Irishmen and David's friend as the leaders of the company, but none of them had any real role in the organization. Victims, unable to get in touch with anyone running the company, started filing police reports in their countries. Soon, authorities in Ireland, England, and the United Arab Emirates, Spain, the US, and Canada launched investigations into the Cartoons brands. The Times of Israel released an expose of the corruption behind binary options trading, while the Irish Central Bank's money laundering unit launched an investigation into Grey Mountain's huge credit card transactions. The brothers sensed that the authorities were coming after them, so they started to close down their business practices. In July 2017, David Carrut put a petition into Irish court to liquidate Grey Mountain. A whistleblower from their Irish satellite office came forward to police and provided more valuable information about the company's operations. The brothers erased their social media accounts, sold their shares, and built a luxury home in Ontario. By October, the Cartoons had emptied their call centers and transferred millions into offshore accounts. While David stood before a judge claiming that the company was bankrupt, Josh was posting photos of him driving a $300,000 Ferrari in Greece, partying in Kazakhstan, sunbathing in the Pacific Islands, and yachting in the Persian Gulf. In February of 2020, he disappeared. So far, the Cartoons have avoided any real consequences. A court in Texas charged them with engaging in commodity options fraud by deceptive device, but none of these accusations were proven. Lawyers for the Cartoons argued that since the brothers didn't operate their business inside the US, they couldn't be charged. A judge recommended the case be dismissed. In their home province of Ontario, the Securities Commission brought civil enforcement action against the brothers on behalf of 700 Ontario residents who lost a total of $1.4 million through binary options trading with Sandbox Media. David, unlike his brothers, settled with the OSC and paid $315,000 in fines and agreed to a 7-year trading ban. Jonathan and Josh, who never appeared in court, were also banned from Canadian capital markets for 10 to 15 years and ordered to pay $3.4 million. But so far, neither brother has paid a single cent. There's little hope that they'll ever pay, since most of the cartoons' assets lie outside of Canada. Investors' last hope is Ireland, where a pro bono law firm is helping 35 victims, including Hoffman, launch suits against the brothers. They're seeking damages that total $4 million. The first case resulted in a ruling that ordered David and Jonathan to pay $124,000. Other cases are expected to turn out similarly. If the cartoons are ordered to pay their victims, this ruling will be enforceable across the European Union. However, the cartoons' location is currently unknown. It's believed that Josh is in Budapest, Jonathan in Dubai, and David in Dubai or Georgia. Unfortunately, without their presence, it's impossible to enforce any sort of consequences. In May 2020, Josh wrote a letter to Fin Telegram News pleading his innocence and asked the paper to stop implicating his name in the binary options trading controversy. He threw his brothers under the bus instead, saying that it was entirely their business and he had nothing to do with it. Despite the cartoons' criminal wrongdoings, Elaine Hoffman still blames herself. She says it's shame and suffering that has bonded her to the other victims. She never told her husband what transpired before he died in 2021. Hoffman, as a religious woman, says it's her faith that comforts her in this situation. Even though she doubts she'll ever see her money again, she believes that the brothers will face the consequences on Judgment Day. These are some of the saddest and most heartless scams out there. Let's get started with number 6, the Heartless Pastor. Pauline Bryce and her epileptic son had their life savings stolen by Gary and Jamal Soufrant, who posed as pastors selling some land. Gary and his son convinced the 71-year-old Pauline that they had land in Plantation, Florida, and told Pauline to put down $20,000 to get a contract for it. Pauline saw this as an opportunity to get some needed security for her and her son, so she scraped it together, handing over her entire life savings. Pauline had no idea that the pastor who contacted her had been involved in a multi-million-dollar scam of $7 million with his wife. After serving time for this, Gary was back to scam her of her entire life savings while posing as a pastor. At the time, Pauline hadn't seen her own son in weeks and was concerned about him living on the street. The property and plantation would give them both a safe place to stay and ease her stress. Pauline called the police when she realized that she'd been scammed, and they quickly found and arrested Gary. Police were initially unable to find Gary's son and co-conspirator, but Jamal ended up turning himself in a day later. Pauline was happy both men were caught, but was obviously hurt by Jamal, who had once called her grandma and couldn't understand why he'd do this to her. Though both men have been arrested, it's unlikely Pauline will ever see her money again. Number 5, the Heartless Realtor. Richard Troy McConaughey had been homeless for more than a year in San Fernando, having only a picture of his driver's license as a means of identification. One day, Troy received an inheritance check of $73,000 from his grandfather's estate. Planning to turn his life around and get himself off of the street, Troy was excited to cash the check. Troy had attempted to open a bank account on many occasions so he could cash the check, but the lack of any solid proof of identification made it impossible. So he carried the life-changing money for months, hoping to somehow figure out how to get it. Then, Troy met a real estate agent named Allison Renaro, who claimed to be able to help solve his problems by suggesting they open a joint bank account. Since Troy had no other options, thought he might as well give it a shot. So, Renaro got him cleaned up, and in a new set of clothes, they marched into the bank with him. As soon as the money was in the joint account, however, Renaro drained it and left at her first opportunity. Troy had planned to make the most of his second chance. He wanted to get clean by going to rehab and buy an RV so he could get himself off the streets. But all his plans were quickly deflated. McConaughey was fairly well known by residents in the neighborhood he frequented. Gary O'Neill, one of Troy's friends, warned him about Renaro after having met her, expressing that he got a bad vibe. It was also known in the community that Troy was getting a check because he talks a lot, and he'd been warned multiple times. Renaro quit her job while using Troy's money to fund her life. She refused any contact with him, as well as refusing to comment to any reporters, but neighbors have said she's living off the money she drained from the homeless guy. Troy filed a police report, and charges have been filed, but there's been very little movement on the case. Eric Ramsey, Troy's friend, heard what happened to him and started a GoFundMe account. Eric said that he couldn't just watch Troy suffer like that, and something had to be done about it. Now, with more than 600 donors, he has raised about $18,000. Number 4. The Heartless Romance. Cindy Tsai, a Chinese lawyer living in Massachusetts, was diagnosed with gastric cancer not long after getting divorced from her husband of 16 years. Divorce is hard enough in the best of circumstances, but it's even worse when dealing with cancer at the same time. Cindy's ex-husband didn't even show up to support her after her diagnosis or during her first round of chemotherapy, which had the cancer in remission in January of 2021. Unfortunately, in September of the same year, gastric cancer came back and was terminal. Jimmy first texted Cindy in early October 2021, pretending to be looking for Linda, a woman he met at the pet store. Cindy cleared up the misunderstanding, but the two continued talking after learning of their shared Chinese heritage. The relationship blossomed with playful picture exchanges of everything to the food they were eating to goofy selfies. Cindy had found a much-needed companion during her most difficult times, relying on a comfort that couldn't have come at a better time. Cindy was typically a very cautious person, but found herself one of the over 400 victims of romance scams in Massachusetts in 2021. Cindy, at her lowest point, received attention from Jimmy and quickly fell into his trap. Luring her with attention and care, Jimmy pretended to be concerned about her everyday activities and cancer treatment. In the first 10 days of their communications, Cindy was love-bombed by Jimmy, who appeared to be everything she needed, which at that time was endless emotional support. After those 10 days, Jimmy turned the conversation towards money. Jimmy talked about how he moved to the United States and how his family was into the clothing industry in Los Angeles. He also talked about how the pandemic had forced them to close shop. Later, Jimmy moved on to talk about his profession, which was crypto trading, which he said was incredibly successful and compared to Cindy's previous foray into the market of buying and selling real estate. Cindy was hesitant, but Jimmy offered appealing screenshots of his crypto returns. He knew Cindy was also reading about people like Twitter co-founder Jack Dorsey and billionaire Elon Musk, who were heavily invested in crypto, so her hesitancy began to dissipate. Jimmy then showed her an online trading market, which was really just a fake site with a similar name and appearance of a legitimate site. Cindy could pull money back out in the early days just to convince her everything was on the up and up. Jimmy even agreed to a video chat, which Cindy said helped calm her suspicions over apparent red flags. But in the end, Jimmy's confidence tricks made it appear that he was helping her become a crypto success by providing loans into the pretend platform, and it cost her $2.5 million. Sadly, because the scammers operate outside the U.S., Cindy was told not to expect to ever see her money again. Number 3. Cant Buy Me Love. A grandmother, known only as Susie, was relentless in her quest for love. She was so desperate that she managed to get in relationships with 3 men who ended up stealing more than her heart, over 206,000 pounds more, and her house. To Susie, men aren't all they're cracked up to be. Susie first met David, who claimed to be from the UK, with whom she ended up in a relationship. She gave David access to her bank account after he said he needed to buy a laptop. Susie was shocked to find that 42,000 pounds of her father's money had disappeared, along with David. After her first loss, Susie refused to give up on love and went on to have conversations with Johnson Williams. John claimed that he was an American soldier at the war front against the Taliban. John continually pestered Susie with requests for money, so much so that she ended up selling her house to get it to him. She became suspicious when she noticed that her money was being wired to Ghana. Susie had sent Johnson roughly 167,000 pounds. Susie, ever the optimist, was still willing to try for love one last time when she met a Ugandan, Godfrey Kizungo, via Facebook. The two got married in Africa and are still married, but Kisungo had been pestering her constantly for money and Australian citizenship. Susie grew tired of his demands and plans to annul the marriage. In the end, Susie was left with 3 failed relationships, a drained bank account, and no home. She admits that in her longing for a companion, she was desperately trying to buy love and was perhaps a little brainwashed. Number 2. Beta for life. Susan Perry, who was 73 at the time, got into a conversation with a young stranger on Facebook in a bid to search for a boyfriend. Susan had become dissatisfied with her marriage and had gone on a little Facebook adventure in her search for spontaneity that was more than she bargained for. After seeing the younger man's handsome profile picture, Susan was interested in the con man's invitation to chat. Gideon said he had a 14-year-old son named Paul and began feeding Susan various lies about his son's car accidents, subsequent hospital bills, and boarding school tuition in Dubai. Susan was drawn in by Gideon's daily sweet messages and his nice-sounding French accent. She would talk with him for hours on end and called him when her husband wasn't around. Susan loved that Gideon was so genuinely interested in her life. Gideon loved hearing about her hobbies and told Susan he worked on an oil rig, causing him to be away from Paul, who he dearly missed. When Paul was home from the rig, Paul was often at boarding school in Dubai, leaving Gideon alone and lonely. Susan never hid the fact that she was married, but had sympathy for Gideon. She never revealed her chats with Gideon to her husband because she felt that she wasn't doing anything wrong. However, Susan was so drawn in that she would send online boyfriend money whenever he needed it, starting with £400, which quickly ballooned to £40,000. The first lie fed to Susan was that Gideon's son had been seriously injured in a hit and run and needed help to fund his life-saving surgery. Quickly, Susan loaned out her life savings with assurances of repayment and even pawned her gemstone jewelry when she overdrafted. To continue to build her confidence, Gideon had offered Susan half of his paycheck, which she rejected, feeling it would be wrong to accept the money at that point. One day, Gideon told Susan his rig had been attacked by pirates and he needed £14,000 to get a helicopter to come rescue his men. Worried, Susan sent him the money and waited in anticipation for word on if everyone was okay, and was relieved to find out they were. Gideon kept appreciating her and called her an angel while promising to pay back everything at the end of his work at the oil rig. Susan had maxed out her credit card to pay for Gideon's son's operation from the hit and run and was relieved when she got a message saying Paul had recovered. Gideon next messaged her that he had been paid and would transfer what he owed the next day. This was good news since Susan had many sleepless nights stressing about how she was going to pay off her card. Susan was crushed the next morning when she received a phone call from Gideon's son. His dad had a heart attack and died. Susan was devastated, feeling like she'd lost the love of her life. After coming clean about the ordeal to her husband and daughter, Susan came to the realization that she had been scammed. Susan made a police report, and after an investigation, said there was no trace of any such Gideon or Paul. Gordon, Susan's husband, said he had suspected that things were falling apart and that he was hurt, but took responsibility for not giving his wife the attention she needed. He said he didn't blame her for falling for the con since these guys knew what they were doing. Susan has since paid off her £7,000 credit card loans and bought back her jewelry. She still owes around £15,000 that's going to take more of their golden years to pay off. Number 1. The Heart. TikToker Stephanie Thacker has lived in her car with her dog Millie for nearly a year. She often dropped videos of life in the car with her dog as she searched for a place to rent on Facebook. Thacker's followers were with her every day for months while she toiled away working for DoorDash until she saved enough money to get a place she could afford. Eventually, Stephanie found a place on Facebook and excitedly contacted the owner. The new potential landlord agreed to the place to her and sent Stephanie a legitimate-looking contract. Stephanie sent her entire life savings of over $2,000 as first month's rent and deposit to the landlord using Chime. Once the funds had been received, the landlord disappeared, leaving Stephanie broke. Stephanie showed up at the listing anyway with some hope, but discovered that the property was already rented out. With no place to go, Stephanie camped in her car at the address and called the police to get help. When the police arrived, they told her that it would be a year before she could get her money back. Stephanie quickly reported the case to Chime, with her followers calling the bank app out on social media. Chime's official page responded, saying that they saw cases like this as serious and would investigate. When Chime completed their investigation and found no faults with the transactions, they refused to return Stephanie's money despite screenshots. Her followers were moved by the story and tried to comfort her while telling her to get a new bank, even going as far as reprimanding Chime. As people were comforting her on her page, there was no shortage of comments chiding her for making online transactions with a stranger. There's an entire Reddit forum claiming that Stephanie Thacker is a scammer making up up stories to get people to donate money. The Reddit users claim to have evidence that she's not homeless, that she used all the money she received on GoFundMe to buy clothes, and she's continuing to scam good-hearted people online. One user even posted a conversation with Thacker's dad explaining that she's living with a deadbeat boyfriend, that she does have a place to stay, but that the boyfriend isn't welcome. The most recent update appears to show her living in an apartment with her boyfriend and her playing the victim. It's heartless to steal from someone who's homeless. It's even more heartless to scam people who want to help. Chime may have been right. In September 2003, some of Southern California's most elite wine lovers gathered at Melisse, a Santa Monica restaurant, to attend a $4,800 wine tasting hosted by Rudy Kernewayon. This was his coming out party in the ultra-exclusive wine world where he wanted to show that he was someone who belonged. While sampling rare wines that can be impossible to find, a few attendees were suspicious that they were being deceived. Prominent wine taster Paul Wasserman, whose mother was a prominent Burgundy importer, was unsure of the bottles he was served. Before the tasting, the oldest Petrus he'd had was from 1975, much older than the 1921 Petrus on offer that night. Vintage bottles of Petrus sold for almost $30,000 a bottle, and Kernewayon had an extensive supply. The two bottles that confused him the most were a 1961 Bordeaux that seemed far younger than Wasserman would have expected, and a 1947 Bordeaux that seemed to taste wrong. It's common for people to question the wine in the world of rare wines, although they would rarely do it out loud. Guests at tastings would want to avoid offending the host or making themselves look ignorant. When another guest told Wasserman that the 1961 Bordeaux tasted exactly the same as the last time they had it, he told himself it must be legitimate. Nothing about the wine's appearance seemed off, the colors were appropriate, and the labels seemed legitimate. Born in Indonesia, Kernewayon came to the United States to attend California State University on a student visa in the late 90s. His interest in wine started in 2001 at his father's birthday party. He tried a 1996 Opus 1, was fascinated by the taste. Living in the LA area at the time, he started searching the city for wine and soon had 200 bottles. He attended weekly tastings at a wine store in Glendale called The Red Carpet. At a charity auction in 2002, he bid on a hotly contested bottle of the cult California Syrah Sine Qua Non. He held his paddle up and waited until he won. Soon, he graduated from California wines, moving on to Premier Cru Bordeaux. From there, his attention turned to Burgundy. Burgundy is one of the market's most revered wines, produced in such small quantities that finding bottles can be a huge feat. Kernewayon had a refined palate and a strong memory, two traits that made him a gifted taster. He visited auction rooms and spent $1 million a month, becoming a strong presence in the market. His high bidding was so influential that old wine prices rose dramatically during that time. A bottle of 1945 DRC Romani Conti sold for $2,600 in 2002, but after Kernewayon joined the scene in 2003, it sold for $124,000. Kernewayon had a flashy sense of style, turning up to events in custom Hermes suits, Patek Philippe watches, selvedge jeans, chrome hearts glasses, and crocodile boots. Inside his jacket's flap was a silk lining with a repeating cursive print of Rudy. He teased people for having a platinum Amex card when he had a Centurion card. While he sometimes had a woman on his arm or a brother visiting from Asia, he attended most events alone. Usually, he was about an hour late, which sometimes rubbed people the wrong way as he was seen as arrogant. It was rare that he spoke about his past. He'd tell people he moved from Indonesia to the US to attend Cal State and that his family owned a major Asian beer distributor. Apparently, his family gave him a monthly allowance to stay out of their hair. The little information he shared about his life changed frequently. Sometimes his monthly allowance was $1 million, and others it was as high as $2 million. Other details like the type of beer his family made also changed often. Few people knew details beyond that. Wasserman invited him over for dinner, but he always had an excuse for not going. He didn't seem to want to get too close to people. While he was was distant, he was also very generous. The lineup of wines he had at tastings became critically renowned, with Wasserman singing his praises and Alan Meadows, a Burgundy collector and premier Burgundy critic, becoming a beneficiary of Kerniowan's largesse, having tried wines he'd never encountered before. Kerniowan was accepted and revered in the wine community, with Meadows even publishing tasting notes based on Kerniowan bottles. Arguably, Kerniowan's most strategic friendship was with John Capin, a New Yorker who wanted to turn his family's wine shop in the Upper West Side, Acker, Merrill, and Condit, into a key player at wine auctions. Capin introduced Kerniowan to the 12 Angry Men, a New York-based group of new collectors known for their high standards and who would be offended if somebody brought a cheap bottle of wine to a party. This connection was highly beneficial to Kerniowan, as the more he integrated himself into high-end wine circles, the more legitimate he looked. He had a fixation on Romani Conti and the 1947 vintage, earning him the nicknames Dr. Conti and Mr. 47. They would make a grandiose display of opening rare, expensive bottles at their tastings. Still, as Kerniowan integrated himself more into their circle, he opened bottles that outdid anything the 12 Angry Men produced. Online wine boards sang his praises as well. He'd post his tasting notes and be met with high praise. Some critics didn't like how much he was flaunting his wealth by talking about such expensive wines, but other online community members were quick to defend him, claiming that those critics were just jealous. He made his mark on the scene. The group would start their evenings at Kerniowan's, where they'd drink hyper rarities, like a bottle of 1945 Romani Conti that he supposedly bought for $2 million. They would leave Kerniowan's place and go to Carrut, a Greenwich Village restaurant where he would order all of the expensive bottles off the wine list. After drinking expensive wine at Carrut, Kerniowan had the restaurant send him the empty bottles. Wine aficionados often hold on to the bottles of costly or hard-to-find wines they've drunk, so it wasn't an unusual request. He told them he was building a bottle museum, which might have explained why he ordered more bottles than any other customer and took most of them home. Kerniowan was co-signing at auctions despite earning a reputation as a wine lover and buyer rather than a seller. In 2003, Eric Greenberg, an internet entrepreneur, knew something was wrong with the wine he purchased and reached out to Kerniowan. By the end of the conversation, Greenberg was sure Kerniowan was duped by whomever originally sold him the wine. Capin hosted a top 100 wines of the country weekend, charging $17,500 a head. Attendees tried 2 vintage bottles of Domaine de la Romani Conti. One bottle was a 1937, the other a 1945, which were rare finds that Kerniowan sold to Capin. Something tasted off with the wines, but most of them had never tried the 45 vintage before, and so weren't sure how it was supposed to taste. Meadows joked about only how there were probably less than 1,000 bottles of the 45 made, but many thousands of bottles had been drunk, insinuating that whoever sold Kerniowan the wine had lied to him. Nobody blamed Kerniowan, assuming that with his extensive collection, he was bound to end up with a few phony bottles. Capin believed Kerniowan's cellar was the greatest in the country, presided over Kerniowan's wine cellar auction, and called it the cellar. While the consignor was unnamed, insiders knew it was Kerniowan. Acker Auctions was a second-tier auction house, meaning they received consignments of a couple of bottles rather than an entire case. The cellar would be Acker's first single cellar sale. They sold 1,742 lots and brought in $10.6 million. It was such a hit that they held the Cellar 2 auction 9 months later, selling 2,310 lots at $24.7 million. Acker was now a key player in wine auctions. Kerniowan made $35 million from the auction. He splurged on exotic cars, including a Bentley and a Ferrari, started gutting an $8 million Bel Air house, and spent millions of dollars on contemporary art. He spoke to a reporter about the inevitability of encountering fake bottles, and that spotting them was an art he learned after trying so many wines and inspecting details like the bottles, labels, and corks. Some people were growing skeptical of Kerniowan. His bottles were rare, so having just one of them would be impressive, but he had entire cases. He brought bottles of 1923 Rumier Bonus Maris to auction, but the domain wasn't found until 1924. In 2007, leading Burgundy collector Don Stott hosted an event at his home with Christophe Rumier to sample some of Kerniowan's bottles. A guest pointed out that something was wrong with one of the bottle labels. While the details were correct, their position was reversed, as though the label was photocopied. It was clear that 6 out of the 11 bottles they opened were fake. Doug Barzilay, Barley, a Burgundy collector and good friend to Meadows, wondered if Carrut was intentionally selling fakes. It seemed like Carrut had been duped for a while, but it was happening so often that he could be participating in the operation. Bottles of fake wine were in circulation, and members of the scene needed to find out how. Stott started returning bottles he bought from Carrut to Acker, and crew began destroying all empty bottles. Noted wine collector Bill Koch hired an investigator to search his 43,000 bottle cellar for counterfeits. He hired an investigator who sent 4 Carrut source bottles to be inspected at their respective French chateaux. The chateaus reported that each bottle was fake. Carrut's mysterious wealth was running out. Construction on his Bel Air mansion came to a halt after he received 8 different lawsuits and countersuits. Acker filed a $1 million lien against him, and the money continued to grow, likely due to collectors returning bottles. By the end of that year, he'd racked up $7 million in debt to the auction house. He reached out to wine friends to lend him $1 million, and soon he was $11.5 million in debt. To obtain loans, he understated his liabilities and double-pledged collateral. He scrambled to find new outlets to sell more wine. In an April 2007 auction in Los Angeles, Christie's Los Angeles sent out a catalog that featured magnums of 1982 Le Pin, sourced by Carrut. Aficionados determined they were fakes, and they were pulled. Carrut sold $2.2 million worth of wine to Goldman Sachs partner and chairman of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Faking wine might be easier than it sounds and can be done by blending 2 vintage bottles. For example, a 1981 Petrus with a 1983 Petrus would theoretically make 2 bottles of 82 Petrus. While it might not taste exactly like an 82, it would be different enough from the 81 and 83 to be plausible, and this is precisely what Carrut did. Wines didn't always brand their corks with the winemaker, making it possible to put in a blank cork or ink it with the name of a winemaker. Labels can be soaked off an empty bottle and replaced with a laser-printed new one. Proving that old wines are fake is almost impossible. There isn't information about how many bottles of a particular wine were produced and what packaging was used. Old and rare wines aren't tasted enough for their flavors to be recognizable. Diagnosing a fake bottle is very difficult. Winemakers rarely declare a bottle as fake. Rare wines are typically opened by a generous host, so nobody would dare say they were drinking a fake. Most people in the collectors community were male and loved to show off their collections to anybody they encountered. Nobody in the group would admit to being duped. During an April 2008 Acker auction, Laurent Ponceau, maker of a coveted Burgundy featured in 22 lots at the auction, discovered that Carrut co-signed counterfeit vintages. Ponceau started making Domaine Ponceau in the 80s, but the catalog boasted 1959 and 1945 vintages. Barley told Ponceau about the situation, and they ordered Capin to pull the lots. Ponceau attended the auction to make sure that he did. The crowd started booing when Capin announced that they'd removed the Ponceau lots. It was a rowdy night, with the angry men's notes on the wines they drank getting more outrageous, and they seemed to want to bid on the wines anyway. Pulling so many bottles for being fake made Capin look completely illegitimate to an already suspicious group of experts, especially when it was becoming accepted that many of the wine lots he was selling were fake. The next day, Carrut and Capin had lunch with Ponceau and Barley. Carrut was evasive, saying he'd have to check his records to see where he got the bottles. Later, he emailed Ponceau to tell him that he bought the wines from a man named Pak Hendra in Asia. He gave Ponceau 2 numbers to call, but one went to a Jakarta shopping mall and the other to an Indonesian airline. To rebuild his reputation, Capin stopped accepting Carrut's consignments. Carrut's relationships with many people that he was once close with soured. Alan Meadows felt that Carrut took advantage of him, and some of the group wondered if he was opening authentic wines at tastings but selling counterfeit versions. He found a major auction house, Christie's New York, still willing to take his bottles. At the time, Christie's wine department was losing its footing in the market and needed product. Don Cornwell, a lawyer and wine aficionado, tried to warn Christie's about the fake bottles, but they still went ahead with the auction. A London auction was coming up, and Cornwell took to the popular online forum Wine Berserkers to warn that Carrut would be trying to auction wines there, but still wasn't taken seriously. A president of one of the 2 auction houses holding the sale responded that they had a thorough inspection process to weed out any fakes. The situation reached British online wine media, and pressured auctioneers to withdraw inventory from Kurniawan, including 12 lots of DRC worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Bill Koch filed a civil case in 2009 against Kurniawan that was finally able to proceed after a breakthrough. The FBI had been quietly investigating him and discovered that he had lived in the country illegally since 2003 after the denial of his asylum application. His status turned him into a flight risk, leading the FBI to file a search warrant. On March 8, 2012, FBI agents knocked on his door early in the morning, and he was arrested in his pajamas. During their search of the house, the FBI found thousands of labels for top wines, including a 1947 Lafleur, Lafite, Romani Conti, and a 1950 Petrus, as well as hundreds of new and cold corks. He had a mechanical device for inserting them, lead capsules, sealing wax, and rubber stamps with vintages and chateau names. They also found glue, stencils, pattern scissors, and warm white Ingress drawing paper. He had detailed instructions on fabricating labels for 1962 Domaine Ponceau Clos de Roche and bottles of cheap Napa Valley wine that he'd marked with the names of old Bordeaux wines. Bottles were soaking in the kitchen sink to make it easier to remove their labels. The evidence against Kurniawan didn't just hurt his reputation. People who went into business with him dealt a blow to their credibility, like Paul Wasserman, who stored and traded some of his wine. Many believe that Wasserman was too much of an expert in the field to be deceived by Kurniawan. His respected family name was tarnished, and his knowledge of old wine was questioned. After all, he posted tasting notes of Kurniawan's wines. Capin and Meadows also wrote notes on Kurniawan wines, having given him the benefit of the doubt despite indicators that he wasn't who he seemed. Wasserman hoped he'd once sold legitimate wines and only started co-signing counterfeit bottles when he faced financial troubles. After being indicted in New York, Kurniawan faced up to 100 years in jail for 4 counts of mail and wire fraud. Directors Jerry Rothwell and Ruben Atlas met at Kurniawan's trial. Rothwell was following Lauren Ponceau on the trial of his counterfeit wine. Atlas read about the trial in New York Magazine and was intrigued by Kurniawan, who at his core was a thief but only stole from the wealthy. The pair spent a lot of time together and soon decided to tell Kurniawan's story. Earlier in his career, he was followed by a film crew and intended to make a food and wine show, although it never materialized. Atlas and Rothwell obtained the footage and began making the documentary Sour Grapes. Originally, they wanted an interview with Kurniawan, but never got time with him. The story's angle changed, and their focus went from the con man to the con. Some collectors didn't want to be filmed as they were too embarrassed that they were duped. At first, Atlas was rooting for Kurniawan, who targeted people with money to blow. Over time, his opinion changed after learning more about the people he conned and the winemaking process. Koch's investigators were the first to discover that Kurniawan's real name was Zhen Wang Huang, although he didn't find this suspicious as ethnic Chinese often adopt local names. Kurniawan wasn't the first person in his family to act as a con man. His uncles were imprisoned for committing massive fraud, allegedly stealing $800 million that was never recovered. As of February 2012, Kurniawan still owed $3.5 million to Acker, Merrill, and Condit from loans they'd given him. In April 2013, Kurniawan faced 2 additional charges, one for selling 6 bottles of Domaine Georges Roumier Bon Maris 1923 for $95,000, worth just under $130,000 today, despite Domaine Georges Roumier not producing wine until 1924, and another for selling Jeroboam of Chateau Mouton Rothschild 1945 for almost $50,000, worth roughly $65,000 in today's money. In December 2013, the jury found him guilty, and in August 2014, he received a 10-year sentence in federal prison. Koch and Kurniawan settled their lawsuit out of court in July 2013 for $3 million in damages. In January 2015, the authentic wines in his collection sold for $1.5 million. After his November 2020 release, Immigration and Customs Enforcement took him into custody, and in April 2021, they deported him back to Indonesia. All told, he sold roughly 12,000 fake bottles, thousands of which are probably still in people's private collections. What happens when people are born with scamming in their bones? They can't help but just try the wildest schemes to separate people from their money. Let's start with number 5. Pretend billionaire, real prison. Justin Costello claimed he was a billionaire and he threatened to make cops pay for trying to arrest him. But Justin Costello was not a billionaire. Justin Costello was a con man. And Justin Costello conned businesses and investors into thinking he was rich. The first time our fake billionaire got in trouble with the law, he was drunk. Costello was at a lodge and spa, and according to staff members, he got into a drunken rant and started harassing employees. He told them that he was a billionaire and that he could do anything he wished to them, Montgomery Burns style. Costello's rants were so expressive and confident that staff members truly believed that he was a billionaire and could make good on his threats. They were so threatened that they decided that only the police could deal with their drunken, high-value customer. When the police arrived, Justin continued to wave his fake billionaire story in their faces. The police didn't care about that and warned him to calm down. Justin, now apparently believing his own story, felt his pretend billionaire status gave him the right to ignore the very real police, and he approached one of them with a clenched fist. Apparently, Justin Costello also fights like Mr. Burns, so things were over pretty quickly, and he got arrested. Despite being cuffed, Justin continued to threaten the officers. He told the police that arresting him would cost them a lot of money and that they needed to uncuff him so he could punch their lights out. It didn't really seem like a good reason to take his cuffs off, so they did not comply. Instead, the police ignored his ramblings because that's what they generally do to drunk people. However, threatening a police officer is an actual crime, and our fake billionaire was eventually booked for the very real crime of obstruction and harassment. He was convicted and ordered to complete 40 hours of community service. Costello was also ordered to avoid consuming alcohol and drugs for a year and banned from contacting witnesses or the lodge. Despite this, Justin didn't relent on his claims about being a billionaire. His lawyer even backed up his claims and told the prosecuting lawyer that Justin was a Harvard graduate who was rich enough to pay off witnesses. The second time the police caught our wannabe billionaire, he wasn't lucky enough to escape with just community service. This time, Costello was facing an indictment of charges related to serious fraud, and these charges carried very long sentences. So Justin did what any fake billionaire would do. He ran away. His plan was simple. He would take all his wealth and just leave the country. He had 6 gold bars worth around $12,000, Mexican pesos worth $10,000, and US cash around $60,000. Unfortunately for him, his plan didn't quite work. The FBI was on the case, and Costello was captured about an hour and a half from Mexico's border. When he was captured, he told the police that he didn't surrender to the court system as agreed because he'd recently had a stroke and was trying to recover. Sure, Justin, sure. After his arrest, the prosecutors on his case told the court that he needed to be held without bail because this billionaire was a flight risk. And Justin was like, nah, while staring at the door. Once Justin was in jail and his trial started, details about his fraudulent actions were revealed. He lied to several investors that he was a billionaire, Harvard graduate, an Iraq war veteran who owned a hedge fund with over $1 billion in management. Honestly, being all of that doesn't just make him a billionaire investor. It also makes him Batman. Costello's lies were so effective that he managed to scam about 29 investors of around $25 million in total. He also used around $40,000 of investor funds to throw a lavish wedding party for himself. In the end, Justin's lies couldn't save him. He was eventually hit with a 25-count indictment in Washington State. His trial is still set to be scheduled, but he faces up to 40 years in prison and up to $5 million in fines. That should be pocket change for our fake billionaire, right? Number 4, no more bluffs. Bill Giordano is a professional poker player who managed to set up a Ponzi scheme that defrauded people of over $72 million. But he didn't do this alone. He had, alongside him, a former Scoresby accountant called Robert Zaya, and they both carried out a fraud of gigantic proportions. Giordano and Zaya didn't just burn customers by defrauding them. They also burned them by pleading guilty to their charges and avoiding trial. The entire fraud scheme couldn't have been successful without insider help from the Commonwealth Bank. The guilty pleas of the card dealing and Ponzi scheming duo meant that victims will never really know the role the bank played in building this fraudulent house of cards. The fraud was simple. Robert Zaya would use his connection to scout for wealthy clients, and Giordano would forge documents in those clients' names to request excessive loans that the clients could not pay off. The only way that Giordano could have ever gotten away with this play was if he had contacts at the bank who approved his forged documents, which he did. One such contact was called Brendan Epps, who was described as the inside man. However, Epps died of a brain aneurysm way back in 2007, and after his death, Giordano had to forge other contacts at the bank. One of the plays that Giordano and Zaya made was on Jim Barker and his wife Debbie. Jim made only $80,000 per year, but suddenly discovered that his loan application document mentioned that he made $343,000 at the time, and this document had been used to apply for a loan of $1.5 million, which was impossible for Jim to finance. Jim wasn't particularly happy to hear that he'd gotten into perpetual debt because of fraud, so he reported the case to the Commonwealth Bank. The bank's assessment analysis read the report and agreed that yes, it was indeed a fraud. The plan was to report the fraud to the police and let them take it from there. However, the bank only made the report 4 years later when the entire scheme was already unraveling. Meanwhile, the Bakers had to sell their home to finance fraudulent loan that Giordano had gotten on their behalf. So what did these two fraudsters spend all their money on while literally forcing people to lose their homes? Well, let's just say they lived like kings. Robert Zaya siphoned around $26 million into his family's trust. As one would expect, both Giordano and Zaya used the money to fund private gambling meetups and expensive trips to Las Vegas and Macau. The duo also bought a fleet of luxury cars, a jet ski, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and even owned a speedboat named Bad Boys. Even for fraudsters, that's a little bit on the nose. In the end, the scheme unraveled, and the Bad Boys eventually had to face the law. And the law treated them like the bad boys they were. They were faced with 142 counts of fraud and eventually had to plead guilty. Giordano was sentenced to 12 years in prison, and Zaya got 10 years for his efforts as well. Number 3. Property Wars. Scott Minaj is a former star of Property Wars. If you didn't know, Property Wars is a reality TV show on Discovery Channel. Aside from being a reality TV star, Minaj also happened to be quite the property warlord. However, instead of winning property wars for his clients, he just stole from them. And after years of stealing from his clients, Minaj was eventually caught by the police and pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and even identity theft. Minaj operated a real estate firm whose business was to use loans to invest in real estate, but instead of investing, he embezzled about $30 million. Minaj, whose name sounds like it's in past tense, used the embezzled cash to support a lavish lifestyle. He traveled a lot, bought luxury vehicles, and purchased million-dollar homes. Vladimir Minaj had spent so much money lavishly that he ran out of money and could no longer access more loans. Ordinarily, when someone is faced with a complete disaster, they typically stop doing the dumb things that got them into the mess. But Minaj wasn't that kind of man. He was already used to the trappings of a royal lifestyle, so he decided to get even more hardcore with his fraud. He built an elaborate identity theft scheme and started using the identities of recently deceased individuals to send credit applications from his furniture store. The loans were never used to purchase any furniture, and Minaj just managed to spend it all. He allegedly caused banks around $2 million in losses through this ruse. In the end, it took an organization of government agencies to take our property warlord down. Minaj only got caught when the Department of Homeland Security, Homeland Security Investigations, and Internal Revenue Service criminal investigations got involved. In court, Minaj had an impressive rap sheet. He was charged with bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and money laundering. The court heard that he defrauded up to 200 victims, and he was ordered to pay up to $33.5 million as restitution to these victims. He also got a 17-year prison sentence for his war crimes. In any case, it's sort of ironic that a real estate investor will have only one room and one bed to call home for the next 17 years. Number 2. Bordeaux Sellers. Stephen Burton and Andrew Fuller ran a scheme where they defrauded a bunch of investors with a loan scheme that was collateralized by wine. Yes, it sounds weird to us too, but it happened. Before we dive into this scheme, let's talk about the perpetrators. Who are Stephen Burton and James Wellesley? The duo had a criminal history before now, and these new charges aren't their first taste of the law's vintage 22. Stephen Fuller, for one, was sentenced to 6 years in prison in 2013 after he admitted to charges including fraud and forgery over a property scheme. The duo also faced civil charges relating to fraud the year before they were recently arrested. They were found guilty in that judgment and had to pay £56 million in restitution to their victims. But the present charges they face are are criminal, and they are unlikely to get away with a fine. Both men ran a business called Bordeaux Cellars, where they made outrageous promises to their investors, claiming that they would get a 12% quarterly interest rate on their investments. These funds would be lent to wealthy borrowers who needed cash, and the cash would be backed by expensive wines. The loans, they said, would be worth just 35% of the wine's value, so lenders would easily get their money back if any borrower defaulted. However, there was one tiny problem. There were no borrowers, and there was no expensive wine. In the end, the criminal fake wine hoarding duo was able to scam investors of almost $100 million. The business plan made no sense if you thought about it. Why would a person rich enough to own dozens of cases of the most expensive wines want to get loans at 16% interest? People with that much money definitely had better options. Burton said he'd gotten the idea for the scam from a Sunday Times article where he read that a man lent billionaires short-term loans and they gave him their luxury vehicles as collateral. The only difference was that Burton had copied a legal business model and had made it into a Frankenstein monster of an illegal one. In the end, the scam was uncovered when in 2019, the payments of quarterly interest to Bordeaux Cellars lenders abruptly stopped. All it took was one investor having his lawyer do some research. The lawyer looked up the business and found little evidence of trading activity and no audited records. This discovery set off a chain of events that led to the police investigating the whole scheme. Burton and Fuller were able to get their hands on a total of £76 million from investors. Fuller was eventually arrested and is currently behind bars. Burton, on the other hand, was also arrested but was released due to COVID concerns. Despite currently serving a 4-year sentence, he fled the country and is currently still on the lam. Number 1. The Crypto King. Self-described Crypto King, Ivon Pletersky, scammed investors out of millions of dollars intended for crypto and foreign exchange investments. This young Canadian Crypto King deceived his subjects, including Diane Moore, who was referred to Pletersky by a longtime friend. She wanted to invest the $60,000 she had set aside for her grandchildren's education. Moore's investment would have a 70-30 split on any gains, meaning she would get 70%, and King Pletersky would receive the other 30%. In her contract, it stated that her investment would target gains of 10 to 20% every 2 weeks, and she would be repaid her entire initial investment in full if any of it was lost. Moore ended up becoming one of the 29 creditors involved in a bankruptcy proceeding against Pletersky after he lost her grandchildren's money. A fraud recovery law firm began investigating Pletersky and called out for information about him. The founder of Investigation Council PC, Norman Groot, was shocked by the response they received. Around 140 people who invested a total of $20 million responded. Investors participated in the same 70-30% split as Moore, and their goal was 10 to 20% growth bi-weekly. However, the interest rate of 5% a week was unrealistic in the open market. While investors struggled to recover their lost money, His Majesty Pletersky enjoyed an extravagant lifestyle fit for the Crypto King he self-described as. He owned 11 vehicles, including 2 McLarens, 2 BMWs, and a Lamborghini, and flew on private jets. The rent for his lakefront mansion was $45,000 a month. Pletersky marketed himself through paid-for promotional articles where he'd talk about his success using crypto to buy and sell in-game items in video games. The articles would list his credentials, including investing in Bitcoin early. As he watched it grow in popularity, Pletersky capitalized on the growing stock and maximized the return on his investment. The articles also spoke about Pletersky's plans to start his own company, using his vast knowledge of the crypto industry to help investors obtain the same success as him. Investors questioned Pletersky for more than 5 hours during a creditors meeting. They demanded to know why His Majesty kept investing money when he couldn't repay current investors. The king's excuse was that he was just a kid, like King Joffrey, but 50% less evil and with 100% less beheadings, so there's that. Pletersky's lawyers said the claims against his client were exaggerated. Pletersky had never actually solicited money from investors. Instead, people saw how successful he was when he invested in crypto as a teenager and wanted to recreate the same success. Pletersky's lawyer pointed out that none of the investors considered that the crypto market is volatile and a young Pletersky probably needed to be better qualified to handle their investments, essentially blaming the victims for trusting him because that's always been a solid legal defense. Despite his lawyer's claims that it was the victim's own fault, Pletersky clearly deceived investors. He provided them with pictures and videos of statements from a foreign exchange crypto platform showing that he had $300 $111 million in his business account. However, an investor reached out to the trading platform and notified them that Pleterski and his business didn't have royal coffers filled with those funds. It's unlikely that investors will get their money back, and some used a line of credit for their investments. Apart from the bankruptcy, their other legal option would be to report Pleterski to the Ontario Securities Commission and the police. Pleterski was almost arrested twice after refusing to hand over his diamond-studded Rolex, Audi, and cell phone to a bankruptcy trustee in efforts to recoup some of the $25 million Pleterski allegedly owes 119 investors. Threats of arrest were necessary to deal with Pleterski's alleged lack of cooperation ever since the Ontario Superior Court of Justice declared him bankrupt. While claiming bankruptcy, His Highness was still driving a car worth $150,000 while wearing a diamond-studded Rolex that he refused to offer up to the trustee. Even with his assets seized, only $2 million of the $25 million has been recovered, and Pleterski's friends and family aren't being very cooperative either. With over $23 million still unaccounted for, it seems that Pleterski is actively hiding his money, though the trustee is attempting to subpoena bank records of various wire transactions. Unfortunately, the money recovered won't be distributed for a while, and the amount returned to investors will most likely be far less than what is owed. What happens when you start scamming at a young age? Let's find out all the things that could go wrong and start with number 5, frat funds. Former University of Georgia student Syed Arbab used his frat house to run a hedge fund. Most of his clients were friends and family who Arbab was going to help make them a lot of money. Arbab's fund operated between May 2018 and May 2019 through his business entities, Artis Proficio Capital Management and Artis Proficio Capital Investments. Arbab managed to raise at least $269,000 from only 8 investors for his fund based on his previous successes playing the stock market. The only real issue was that the hedge fund wasn't as much of a hedge fund as it was more of a Las Vegas fund that included gambling, liquor, hotels, Ubers, and interpretive dance shows. Arbab asked his friend, Connor Campbell, if he'd like to invest in the hedge fund. Campbell, being close with Arbab since high school, trusted him completely. Besides, Arbab already had some measure of success, so it seemed like a good bet. Campbell's first investment was only $5,000, but Arbab quickly convinced his friend to add an additional $1,500 with the promise of greater returns. But when it came time to pay out, Campbell only received a list of excuses. Arbab, being the cute little Ponzi scammer that he was, had actually been directing the investment funds towards payouts for earlier investors using applications like Cash App and Venmo to get the new investors to send the direct payments. Arbab had sold his investors on the fact that he was a University of Georgia graduate working on his master's degree in business administration. But the truth was that he hadn't even received his undergraduate degree. Yet he flaunted his wealth on social media as if he were the most successful trader there ever was, even posting about buying a new Corvette with cash. Arbab's posts caught his friends' attention, who were poor college students that would have loved some extra money. He seemed like the real deal, and solidified that belief by circulating a fictitious spreadsheet that touted how well his fund was performing. Arbab lied about the total investment funds he'd received from investors and promised high return rates that ranged from 22% to 56%, which he then used to entice further investments. Overall, Arbab scammed 117 investors out of roughly $1 million. Many of these investors were fellow students and friends. Arbab sold investors many lies. Aside from the astronomical return rates, he also promised the first $15,000 they invested would be risk-free, making the decision to invest an easy one. The appeal of the first $15,000 being risk-free meant that most investors spent less than $15,000. Many were nervous about the unpredictable unpredictable market and expected to be paid back at least their principal investment. Arbab later admitted that he did not have the funds available to follow through on his promises, but he kept that knowledge to himself. The SEC filed a civil complaint against Arbab in June 2019, and he was quickly arrested. Arbab pleaded guilty to securities fraud and apologized to his victims. We're sure they felt much better after hearing it. In October 2020, U.S. District Judge C. Ashley Royal in Georgia gave him the maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. After his time in prison, he will have 3 years of supervised release. Additionally, he was ordered to pay $509,032 in restitution. Arbab and 5 friends were also accused of running what the SEC called, quote, a free riding scheme from May 2019 to January 2021. The group made over $2 million in false deposits from empty or underfunded bank accounts into trading accounts at 2 brokerages. The deposits provided the group with over $1.5 million in instant credits to be used for stock trades. The group then attempted to withdraw all trading profits before the brokerages could discover the insufficient funds and freeze the accounts. Arbab and the crew made gains of less than $8,000, but their underfunded or unfunded trades cost nearly $150,000 to the brokerages. Arbab allegedly started his free riding scam while he was literally under investigation for running his first scam. Say what you want about the kid. When it comes to scamming, he's a little go-getter. Arbab's co-conspirators gave Arbab their brokerage account login information to allow him to personally engage in free riding on their accounts. Other times, Arbab instructed his friends in real time through text about how to free ride using their own accounts. Arbab allegedly conducted this scheme just before starting his prison sentence and was indicted while currently serving out his 5-year sentence. Number 4. The Transparent Scheme. Serial entrepreneur Justin Kimbrough started trading penny stocks when he was only 18 years old. He had converted $3,000 to $100,000 while he was still in college. After making such a huge profit, Kimbrough dropped out of college. He didn't want to be taught business by professors who didn't own businesses and felt that if anyone should be teaching those classes, it was him. So he went to work at a multi-level marketing company where Kimbrough learned many foundational business principles, including the power of personal relationships and using those relationships to tap into other professional networks. After leaving the multi-level marketing company, Kimbrough started his own business consulting firm. This firm specialized in sales and networking, helping his clients scale their social media, branding, and income. Since Kimbrough used his business contacts and relationships to succeed, he wanted to pay it forward and help other people do the same thing. Kimbrough didn't feel he was directly competing against a particular company and claimed to be completely transparent when creating his businesses so that others could see his techniques and emulate them. He believed that his transparency separated him from other entrepreneurs. When he wasn't teaching others how to make money, Kimbrough played golf or advocated for the environment. He was a vegan and invested in charities and nonprofits that worked to improve the planet. Well, this was all that was said on a puff piece about Kimbrough on VentsMagazine.com. This was a piece that Kimbrough himself most likely wrote because guess what? In June 2022, the SEC announced that Kimbrough was charged with operating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. Talk about paying it forward. The SEC sought civil damages from the 25-year-old and requested a jury trial against Kimbrough. His charges were 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and 4 counts of wire fraud. Despite his image as a hard-working entrepreneur, Kimbrough was running a Ponzi. He worked with Terry Nicopolis, and the pair would tell potential investors that the company TKJ Investments Corp. was a real estate wholesaler. They obtained at least $3 million from 31 investors. Kimbrough and Nicopolis operated another business called Preeminent Trade Group, where they told investors that the company specialized in reselling medical equipment in India. They used the funds they obtained with TKJ Investments to attract more Preeminent Trade Group investors. People who invested in TKJ Investments could either be paid back their principal or move the money into Preeminent, which at least 3 people did. Kimbrough wired some of the investors' money into his Wells Fargo business account. Investments stopped in April 2021, and Kimbrough trained Nicopolis on how to approach angry investors who wanted their return on investment. In July 2022, the SEC charged Nicopolis and Kimbrough with operating a Ponzi scheme. The attorney's office for the Eastern District of Texas also filed criminal charges against Kimbrough. Number 3. Sales experience. Ian Bick is a scammer who ran a Ponzi scheme that defrauded people of around $500,000 back when he was just 17 years old. Bick was able to defraud at least 15 investors of almost $500,000. And these investors weren't strangers to him. They were his friends, former classmates, acquaintances, and their parents. Bick was the champion of equality when it came to defrauding people. Everyone and anyone could get it. Ian was really good at convincing his investors of his experience in doing business. He told potential investors that he could use their funds to generate very high returns by using them to purchase electronic devices such as iPhones for resale on the internet. Bick also claimed that he could generate high returns by organizing and promoting concerts at various venues in Connecticut and Rhode Island. To sell this lie, he told investors that he had years of experience in promoting concerts like this, and they were a sure moneymaker. He even set up an entertainment agency to make his lies seem more believable. We're gonna guess that he told his investors he just looked 17 and was not actually 17. But his lies could never stand the test of time. For one, the electronics resale business never got set up, and the concert business was a giant lie. As you might expect, Ian was eventually caught. However, Ian didn't behave like a regular juvenile delinquent when he got caught. The judge released him on bond after his first appearance, but Ian didn't use his time outside prison to do anything constructive. Instead, he continued his money laundering activities until the judge had to revoke his bond. At his trial, Ian Bick was charged with 6 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of money laundering. Afterward, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. During his sentencing trial, Ian apologized profusely for his conduct, but the judge wasn't entirely sure that he was being honest. And how could he? Ian had proven to be a stone-cold liar and scammer. When it was time to sentence Ian, the judge was sort of lenient. He argued that Ian was still a very young man and that his crimes might have been because of his youth. However, one of his victims made a rebuttal that yes, Ian was young, but his age didn't stop him from lying to investors and fleecing them of all they had. Bick got sent to timeout 3 years to think about what he did. Number 2, a SIM pull scam. Yusef Selassie stole people's identities and took roughly $1 million worth of crypto through a SIM swapping scheme that he operated when he was just 19 years old. SIM swapping is when a thief transfers a victim's number to their own phone. Once the information is transferred, the thief can send and receive text messages and make phone calls with the stolen number. The thief can circumvent security measures by receiving text messages containing security codes that they can then use to access the victim's accounts. Selassie passed the two-factor authentication security measures by requesting that recovery codes be texted to the numbers associated with the account that he had hacked. Once inside their emails, he checked to see if they had crypto accounts. Selassie then changed the password so his victims could no longer access their accounts, giving him complete control. While he was doing this, his victims' accounts would go offline. Over 4 months, Selassie stole $1 million in crypto and the identities of 75 people. He targeted high-paid executives that worked in industries known to deal with crypto. Selassie designed his scheme around stealing crypto because it's hard to trace when it's stolen and transferred to another account. After authorities searched his Brooklyn apartment, he abruptly moved to California but was arrested in Corona and later arraigned. When authorities executed search warrants on Selassie's California and Brooklyn residences, they found a Gucci wallet, various high-end jewelry pieces, and 2 Rolex watches. They also seized a half-dozen iPhones. The crypto in his electronic wallet was harder for investigators to obtain. They eventually could access it. In Manhattan Supreme Court, Selassie pleaded not guilty to identity theft, scheme to defraud, first-degree grand larceny, computer tampering, and computer trespass. Selassie's SIM swapping scam was one of many that the DA had seen that year. Number 1. Card cracking. Rapper Young Ash used social media to lure her fans into a credit card scheme. Young Ash, whose real name is Ashley Batista, worked with 4 co-defendants on a card cracking scheme. A card cracking scheme is when scammers offer victims a fast and easy money-making opportunity, primarily through a direct message on social media. Scammers use posts where they brag about leading a luxurious lifestyle by sharing pictures of things like cash, luxury cars, and designer clothing. They claim they can help other people get rich too. Her single money is all about making money. In the song, young Ash brags about being a millionaire and living a luxurious lifestyle. The subject matter and lyrics were groundbreaking, as if no one had ever done a song like that before. Her fans were likely really impressed by her lifestyle featured in the song. Young Ash had a substantial social media following and took to Snapchat to flaunt stacks of cash that she said she would give followers in exchange for their bank information. She also posted on Instagram, where she currently has around a little over 50,000 followers. On one of her Twitter posts, Ashley tweeted that if her followers were serious about making money, as opposed to people who are far less serious about making money, they should retweet her, and she would DM them. She'd only look to scam someone that was at least 18 because, you know, she was responsible like that. She didn't want to scam any minors. Acting as a recruiter, once Bautista had a person's information, she worked with the scammers to forge checks and ATM cards they used to steal money from the victims. One of the other people involved in the scam was Gabriel Molina, who worked as a concierge at luxury Manhattan apartment building. He collected rent checks for the building and security, took pictures of them. Molina would then work with the rest of the people involved in the scam to create forgeries of the checks. They used the forged checks to deposit money into Bautista's fans' account and withdrew money using the fans' ATM cards. Justin Simon, Jared Bailey, and a third person who went by the name JD Glasses were in charge of picking up the ATM cards, depositing the checks, and withdrawing the money. Overall, the group stole $62,550. Authorities arrested Bautista and charged her with grand larceny. She appeared before a Manhattan Supreme Court when she pleaded not guilty and was released without bail. Did she ever get any actual jail or prison time? We couldn't find any information about her sentencing. Today, young Ash is still making new music, and it looks like she's given up on her career in card cracking. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comment section who you'd rather never have to deal with again. Fake business gurus ads trying to sell seminars, or robocallers on your phone.